A Patriots Faith, Chapter 5. As Carson Lee and Paul Connor stepped off the plane, the limo driver greeted them on the tarmac and showed them to the limo. He waited outside to load their bags into the trunk as the ground crew emptied the cargo hold. Within minutes, they were off and headed out to the Lee homestead. Carson's cell phone was blowing up. Just having landed less than a half an hour earlier, he already had received 27 calls, all of which he chose to ignore. Mostly from staffers and Senate associates, and 3 from Joel McAdams himself. The phone rang again as Senator McAdams tried once more to reach Carson Lee. Carson looked at the display on the phone, lowered the window on the limo door, and casually pitched the phone out and into the weeds on the side of the road. He looked over at Paul, who had a concerned look on his face. Carson smiled and said, "Man, that felt good, brother." Then he said, "Relax, Paul. This is the first day of the rest of our lives." Paul Connor managed to force a half smile and replied, "Yes, sir." Carson grimaced. "No more sir, Paul. Those days are over." Paul nodded and sat back in his seat. Carson pulled his personal cell phone from his coat pocket and hit the number 1 on the speed dial. After several rings, a voice answered on the other end of the line. Carson replied, "Hi, honey, it's me. I'm on my way home. I'll be there in about an hour." Angela Lee asked her husband, "You're on your way home? Is everything okay, honey?" "Yes, everything's fine. Actually, everything is better than it has been in quite some time, and I have a feeling it's only going to get better from here, baby. Pull a few ribeyes and some of those steelhead I caught during break out of the freezer. I'm going to ask Paul and Katie to come over to grill out for dinner." He looked over at Paul, who nodded, and proceeded to call to inform his wife of the plans. Carson said goodbye to his wife and sat back, put his head back, closed his eyes. He let out a long, deep sigh. The limo meandered along on the way up into the mountains. The 4 friends grilled outside and sat by the fire pit late into the night. They contemplated their futures, their individual futures, as well as a collective future. Carson felt free, more free than he had felt since before he joined the Army. Paul felt it too, but unlike Carson, he was less secure in his options going forward. Paul had always been the kind of guy to generally overthink things, sometimes even to the point of worrying himself. Truth be told, he had a great skill set. He was highly trained in tactical operations during his time in the military. He also expanded on that knowledge and practice during his time as security chief and senatorial personal aide to Carson during his tenure in the Senate. That quality in him which made him overthink things was actually the same quality that allowed him to have great success in security operations. His ability to analyze thoroughly every possible scenario lent itself well to that skill set. Paul and Katie stayed the night. Carson had a guest room above his barn, which had its own full bathroom and a small kitchenette. Paul and Katie lived an hour away and so had spent many nights in the guest suite on the Lee's homestead. The next morning, as the 4 of them gathered for breakfast, the phone hanging on the wall rang. Carson picked it up. It was James Darling, Carson's old classmate and head of Trans-Alaska Fuels Global. "Good morning, Senator Lee. I'm sorry to call your home, but I couldn't get through on your cell. It went directly to voicemail." Carson smiled to himself as he thought of his Senate-issued cell phone laying in the weeds somewhere between Anchorage and home. "I trust the flight and limo ride home were okay," Darling continued. "Did they have everything you needed on board?" he asked. Carson responded, Yes, James, everything was very nice. Thank you so much for your generous hospitality. I really appreciate it, buddy. James Darling smiled on the other end when Carson referred to him as buddy. Oh, good, Senator. I was happy to be able to help. If you ever need anything else, you don't hesitate to reach out now, okay? And when you get the chance to get down here, remember, my door's always open. I'd love to talk some more about you coming on board with us here at TAF. When you are ready, of course. No pressure. I know you got a few months left up there in Washington. Carson paused for a moment and said, I will, James. Thanks again. The two exchanged a couple more pleasantries, and the call was ended. Carson didn't feel the need to explain his abrupt departure from Washington to James Darling. Before Carson could sit back down, the landline rang again. Carson frowned and turned to pick the receiver up off the wall-mounted rotary dial phone. Hello, he said. Carson, is that you? It's good to hear your voice. Am I catching you at a bad time? Asked Pastor Scanlon. No, not at all, answered Carson, wondering how his pastor knew he was home. He looked over at Angela, who smiled warmly and mouthed with her lips almost inaudibly, Sorry. Pastor Scanlon's wife and Angela Lee were best friends, and she had called the house shortly after Angela got off the phone with her husband the day before. She was excited he was coming home unexpectedly and couldn't help telling her friend when she called. Carson smiled at his wife and nodded, letting her know it was no problem, and continued his call with Pastor Scanlon. Carson, I don't know how long you plan to be home for. Some of the men from church are having a meeting Saturday evening in the fellowship room downstairs, and, well, if there's any way you could make it, that'd be great. I know it's last minute, and again, not sure your schedule, but we'd love to have you if you could come. Carson paused briefly before filling Pastor Scanlon in on his departure from Washington and his plan not to return. There was a long pause before James Scanlon spoke. Well, I see. That's interesting, Carson. I hope you're okay. Carson answered, Yes, Pastor, I'm fine. I'm just done. I'm done trying to live in that world, that cesspool of humanity. I'm just burnt out, I guess. Anyway, I'm fine now. Better than ever, in many ways, actually. I'd love to come to the men's meeting Saturday. Count me in. Can I bring anything? No, Pastor replied. Just yourself. We're going to have a sandwich platter and some sodas. Nothing fancy, though. I'm really glad you could make it. Carson, what about your friend Paul? What's he doing these days? Well, he's actually here now. He's unemployed, I suppose, just like me. Carson chuckled. He looked over at Paul, who had a much more serious look on his face. Pastor Scanlon said, Well, we would love to have him come too, if he's free. I've gotten to know him a bit in the time he's been coming with you to church. And now that you're home, maybe we will be seeing more of him and Katie too. Maybe so, responded Carson. I will pass along the invite for Saturday. See you then, Pastor. See you then, Carson. God bless. The call ended. Carson told Paul about the meeting on Saturday, and Angela chimed in almost instantly. Well, that's perfect. Today's Thursday. You guys could just stay here a few days and do the meeting on Saturday and come to church with us on Sunday. It's been forever since the four of us had a chance to spend some real time together. Quality time. Without all that business stuff. What do you think? She looked over at her husband, then at Paul and Katie. Carson said, Sounds like a plan to me. Paul? Paul looked at Katie, who was smiling and nodding, and he said, Sure. Sounds good to me. Angela said, I'll go out and take some stuff out of the freezer for meals. Come on, Katie. Carson smiled and slapped Paul on the shoulder. Cool, he said. Saturday evening, Carson Lee pulled his 1974 Toyota Land Cruiser into the dirt parking lot at the Mountaintop Baptist Church. Others had already started to arrive as well. Carson and Paul made their way downstairs to the fellowship room. It was a modest room in the basement of the old church building. The tongue-and-groove pine board siding in the room never seemed to go out of style. In fact, it was the very same siding Carson remembered from his days in the teen group when they held activities there. The louvered trifold shutters that separated the fully appointed kitchen from the main area were already open, and Paul could smell the brewing coffee. The two men went into the kitchen and each helped themselves to a cup. When a full church event was being held there, the men wouldn't dare enter the kitchen without express permission from one of the ladies in charge of cooking that day. The women were very territorial when it came to food prep. However, when the meetings were men only, as they were tonight, it was much more informal. Carson and Paul greeted the men that were already there, most of whom already knew Paul. At 7 p.m. sharp, Pastor Scanlon started the meeting. He stood up and called the meeting to order. He led the group in prayer before they started to eat. After a little time went by and he finished his plate, he stood up to address the men. Brothers, as most of you are aware, this year has been challenging in many different ways. We have seen unprecedented times, both locally and nationally. Our nation is more divided today than at any other point in my lifetime. Our church is seeing record numbers decline in its membership and offertory giving. We have missionaries all over the world struggling to stay on the mission fields to which they have been called, due to the decline in Faith Promise Missions giving in the local New Testament assemblies. At the national level, the Christian churches are only retaining record low 13% of their youth post-college. Try to struggle to wrap our minds around that number. Of 100 Christian high school students who go off to attend secular college, only 13 of them will stay in church after graduation. Even the Christian universities, once bastions of the faith, are seeing numbers only slightly higher than that. Look at the national news cycles. The moral degradation of our once proud society is slipping to new lows, seemingly every day. Acts of man in the height of his depravity, which once were done hidden in the shadows and under the cover of shameful darkness, are now performed in the open and accompanied, in many cases, by celebration. It doesn't take a prophet or a wise man to see where we are going as a nation. The impending socialistic agenda is real. It's alive and very active today. Socialism leads to communism. True American history is not being taught in our schools and universities today, and has not been for some time now. We are 3 generations deep into a society that has completed an entire cycle of public school instruction without the benefit of biblical input, without a foundation based on the Word of God. Bibles were removed in 1964 from our public education system. Track the moral decline of society in this nation from the almost 200 years prior to 1964 and the now 50-odd years since 1964. Look at the trajectory we are on. The slope of that decline is getting more slippery every day. Every unthinkable thing that our society embraces and desensitizes itself to only make it easier to adapt to the very next unthinkable thing on the list. Just 50 years ago, the murder of an unborn child was almost unheard of. Those that did seek to do it crawled down underneath the seamy underbelly of society to commit these abominable acts. Today, the masses throng together to march in the streets indignantly, demanding the right to terminate life post-delivery. Pastor Scanlon paused for a long moment as he struggled to regain his composure. tears welling in his eyes. He cleared his throat, scanned the group of men before him, and continued. I think you all know and share my beliefs about the Constitution and our Bill of Rights. You all know how passionate I am about the right of every citizen to keep and bear arms, the right of every citizen to speak and express in writing his thoughts, beliefs, and opinions, the right of us all to worship the one true God of the Bible together and in the open. Brothers, you also know that these rights, which are from our Creator, and which we believe to be inalienable, are under attack. They are being taken, a piece at a time, from us. This goes against everything this country once stood for. He paused again briefly. The time will come, I believe, when we will have to stand up and fight to retake these rights, when we will have to use whatever means necessary to preserve these rights for future generations, a time when we, sadly but resolutely, will have to bear arms in defense of our most basic freedoms. Do not misunderstand me, brothers. I do not think we are there yet, and I in no way look forward to that day. However, I do believe it is looming on our horizon. He looked over at Carson and at Paul, who were sitting at a table off to the side of the room. Most of you are aware of the Joseph Project, which I have implemented a few years back when the direction this nation was taking became obvious to me. For operational security of our group and its members and their families, we remain very closed loop about the project and the details of our actions toward that end. You all know Carson, and most, if not all of you, know Paul. Those that do would in no way question their patriotism. I also maintain that those of you that know them as I do would not question their trustworthiness to be counted concerning the matters of this group. However, in an official act, I'm going to call for a vote by show of hands from the group. If any of you, for any reason, do not feel comfortable sharing the details of this group or the Joseph Project with these two men, please raise your hand and your voice of opposition at this time. A moment of silent hesitation followed, broken by the voice of Hodges Menard. Hodges was a local boy, born and raised in the mountain wilderness of southeast Alaska. He earned his living honestly with the benefit of a solid work ethic, learned early in life from his father. Well, with all due respect, I don't really know these men. I know he's a United States Senator. He pointed at Carson. I know he's been a member of this church for quite some time, but I'm not sure it's in our best interest to give him a look behind our curtain, so to speak. He looked over at Pastor Scanlon and said, Preacher, I know you have history with him, but how well do you know the man that he is today? Silence filled the room. Pastor Scanlon spoke. I respect that, Hodges, but I know these men well enough to know that even if they aren't fully in agreement, that they will respect our operational security. Besides, what I am proposing is to introduce them to the concept of what we are doing, not the in-detail specifics. I am personally vouching for them and for their inclusion at this initial level. He scanned the room and saw nods of approval. Hodges saw the reaction as well. Well, preacher, I voiced my concerns. If the group votes to introduce them, I won't oppose it. He looked around the room and traded looks with the other men in attendance before sitting down. Pastor Scanlon called for a show of hands of those in favor of bringing the two men into their confidence. Everyone but Hodges raised his hand. Then Pastor called out, Any opposed? As he and everyone else looked at Hodges. Hodges did not raise his hand. Pastor looked to his right and said, "With that, I'm turning the floor over to Ken Fowler. Ken?" Pastor sat down as Ken stood. Ken welcomed everyone and thanked them for coming. He thanked Carson and Paul for joining them also. He continued to explain the group dynamic. He outlined their structure, mission statement of purpose, and group bylaws. He defined what prepping meant to them. He explained where they saw the nation at this current time, economically, politically, and socially, and where they projected it to be headed. He expressed their disappointment with government and how they thought that it had let them down, how it had let the average American citizen and middle-class family down. He outlined the corruption and cronyism that they observed in politics and government, and how they felt about the need to be self-sufficient in every aspect of their lives. How they felt the need to be prepared for the hard times that they saw as most certainly coming soon to this nation. This nation that had abandoned the principles of God and the sound doctrines found in His Word. He outlined the failure of the church at large to avoid apostasy. He looked over the crowd and made the statement, "Individual Christian, we don't have to fail. Local New Testament assembly, we don't have to fail. But make no mistake, just as every other dispensation before has ended in failure, so will the church age. This sixth dispensation of the age of grace, or the church age as we know it, will end in failure. That failure comes in the form of apostasy. We cannot enter into the 7-year tribulation period or the millennial kingdom reign beyond until this current dispensation ends. It is written in the prophecy of Scripture." He looked Carson dead in the eye and said, "We plan to continue to work together to survive the hard times ahead of us. We would like the both of you to consider joining us. It's a very serious step, one that should not be entered into lightly. I would like you to fully and thoughtfully consider what has been said here tonight. If you have any questions, you can contact any man at this meeting for answers. Please be in prayer for what God would have you to do concerning this matter. We will have another meeting in about a month or so. We would love to have you back at that time, whatever you decide. Please also respect our need for discretion regarding the things covered here tonight." He looked over at Pastor Scanlon, who said, "Thanks, everyone. Meeting stands adjourned." 2 hours and 15 minutes after it began, the meeting was over. The group disbanded. Carson and Paul walked back to the Land Cruiser and drove quietly back home, contemplating what they had heard here tonight.